Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Transitions. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a research fellow at the East-West Center, and I am delighted to be moderating today's event. Our EWC Insights this afternoon features Dr. Jennifer Turner. Jennifer has been the director of the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center, where she creates meetings, exchanges, and publications focusing on a variety of energy and environmental challenges facing China, particularly on water, energy, and green civil society issues. She also serves as senior editor for the Wilson Center's Inside Out publication and the China Environment Forum column on the New Security Beat blog. For today's session, Jennifer will share stories of the stressors on China's deltas and accelerating policies and grassroots action that are trying to protect them. Before we start, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Jennifer's presentation will be roughly 30 minutes long. And then after the presentation, we will move on to the Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. Our next EWC Insight speaker will be Dr. Hugh Ju Chang, and his talk will be on December 14th at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. And in the interest of time, I will hand this over to Jennifer to start her talk.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen so we can get things going here. So I'm super excited to be here. I actually, the first time I went to the East-West Center was back in, I think, 1992. I was there doing a pre-dissertation research, and it was about, my dissertation was on water politics in China, local governments being innovative and naughty, and got to come out to the East-West Center and meet Chinese water experts. It was great. It was the best summer I had in grad school. And also excited that I am part of a team with Fanwen on a new project that is supported by the Luce Foundation called Vulnerable Deltas. The main focus of the project is looking at deltas in Southeast Asia, three deltas in Southeast Asia, and I'll be looking at two also in China. And we're going to be examining the climate, the pollution, and development threats that are making these deltas so vulnerable. And so my talk today is kind of like me kind of kicking off a little bit about what's going on in China. And I'm mainly going to focus on the Yangtze River, because as I was pulling together my slides, I thought, ooh, Yangtze, there's plenty to talk about here. And to start us off, I'm actually going to talk about how my kind of yuan fun, my fate and destiny, kind of led me to be not just giving this talk tonight, but to being on this project. Back in 1987, I was an English teacher in Hunan province, in Changsha, the capital of the chili peppers. And I started getting linked to water issues from about my second week in Changsha. It was a Saturday morning. The foreign affairs officer starts banging on my door really early in the morning. And she was screaming, "Ting shui, ting shui." And I'm like, I don't speak Chinese. What are you saying here? And she calmed herself down and said, the city has a water conservation action, and they're going to turn off our water for 48 hours. I thought that was interesting. I ran around and got buckets and basins and filled them up. And it was a regular pattern for quite a few months in my time in Changsha that different districts of the city would have their water turned off. And so this is, 1987, wasn't even thinking of doing a PhD, but the issue of, water shortage, cities having problems. And then a few months after I started teaching, the Foreign Affairs Office, they were a big part of my life there. They took us out to go see Dongting Lake. It's the second largest lake in China. It is a lake that when the Yangtze River floods, it's an overflow kind of lake. And I was really excited when we were saying we were going there, because I spent most of my life in the Chicago area, and I was picturing like a Lake Michigan, and it is a very big lake. But when we got to the lake, the driver said, well, we're at the lake, but it's not quite the lake. And it was explained to me that Dongting Lake is getting smaller, in part because there was big land reclamation. So they were turning a lot of the land into aquaculture, into farms. And so we were driving and we finally got to see the lake, and it was really pretty. but it kind of, you know, stuck in my mind. I'm like, lake disappearing. I learned later when I was working at the Wilson Center from the folks at WWF that, I mean, over the past 30 years, many other lakes and wetlands have been disappearing because of land use conversion for agriculture or just building on them. I mean, China's lost something like 50% of their wetlands, and I don't know how many rivers and small lakes, but again, the second largest lake getting smaller. One more story related to my time when I lived in Changsha. First weekend that we had a chance to get out of town, we went to Shanghai. Went to the Huangpu River. Many of you on the Zoom tonight probably have been walking on the Bund like I was. So this was 1987, and it didn't quite look as, I mean, the buildings were the same, but it wasn't quite as fancy with all the lights. And it was really exciting. Went up to the river's edge, took one sniff and said, whoa, something doesn't smell right there. And got to talking to some Chinese folks that were walking around with us. And they were telling me stories that, oh yeah, the Huangpu, it caught fire last year. I was like, okay. So in my first months in China, I kept kind of tripping across the fact that there are water problems in China. So it's kind of one of the reasons why I think that I end up working on water in China over time. So talking about deltas, and I'm not going to give a full lecture on exactly what a delta is, except to say that, I mean, if you're from Mississippi, New Orleans, you know, deltas are very much wetlands. And this is an image of Shanghai, the Yangtze Delta. The Huangpu that we saw right here, this is the last tributary that comes into the Yangtze River before it flows into the ocean. So this is Shanghai. You see over on the left side of the screen that there's Taihu. Taihu also feeds into the Yangtze River. It's also a lake under stress, horribly polluted, often has had toxic algae problems. And, you know, so the whole river basin system here has been under stress for various reasons. A major stressor to the Yangtze River. Now we're talking about deltas, but keep in mind, the delta is but a part of the full river. And what happens upstream doesn't just stay upstream. So another challenge I've already talked about, you know, there's water shortages. Now this is another example of water shortages from this summer's heat wave, truly the heat wave from hell. There was 2 months, an area of twice the size of Texas, and much of it in the Yangtze basin, Chengdu, from Chengdu down a bit. They were subjected to like 113-degree heat waves, the most severe recorded in human history to date. And this is an image of Poyang. And Lake Poyang has been drying a lot more over the past 20 years. It's the largest lake in China. This is the largest lake. And its shoreline is getting smaller and smaller. And some of that is coming from the fact that we have dams in the upstream. This is, you know, upstream in the Yangtze River is really the hydropower base of the country. Hydropower is the second largest source of electricity in China and really critical for the government's, you know, meeting its goals for decarbonization, to get off coal. But the river is in crisis at this moment, you know, so back to the heat wave. So we had this huge heat wave downstream, Poyang and other areas, water dropping, people not having access to water. So they had to open up the hydropower, some of not the three gorges all the way, but there was a number of dams upstream that they had to open to help quench the thirst for the people downstream. And one of the impacts from that was that it triggered another kind of temporary, well, we hope temporary coal rebound. I have some numbers down at the bottom that show you that, you know, since the 80s, we've seen, you know, China has worked hard to slowly decrease the percentage of its dependence on coal-fired power. But this is another instance in the last couple of years where they started talking about, we've got to get more coal-fired power plants, because in the upstream in particular, in Sichuan province, they depend like 80% of their electricity on hydropower. And to release it to the downstream was a pretty shocking development for the area. So I think that, you know, I think a lot of Chinese water experts would agree that, you know, the Yangtze River is at a tipping point. And when the river is sick, the delta is also sick. I mean, with all the hydropower on the upstream, it's lessening the flows. It also is lessening the silt. So the delta areas, there is still some aquaculture and farming down there, not a lot, but that, they lose that kind of richness. But, the Yangtze River, it's the third largest waterway in China. It's critical for the economy. I mean, Shanghai, as you know, it's the financial center. It's the busiest container port in the world. And of course, they depend a lot, as I mentioned, on hydropower. But we've seen over the past 5 years that there's been about a 50%, the flow is down about 50% in the Yangtze River, not just from hydropower upstream, but also that the glaciers have been melting, climate change, increasing temperatures, that the river flow, the trajectory is that it is going to continue to go down, not just the Yangtze, but the whole Tibetan watershed, water tower. So this will also impact South and Southeast Asia as well, this kind of trend. The river has also been very overfished, and it's also very polluted. One little stat there is that like 80% of chemical production in China is done in the Yangtze River basin. And for many years, the pollution control policies have not been all that good. All right, let's move on. Jumping back down, let me go back one more thing to say about in the Yangtze River. I alluded to it earlier, so talked a little bit about the upstream, the pollution problems, and in the midstream, there's been a marked loss of wetlands and lakes, and that's also put stress just on the ecosystem as well. Now let's move further back downstream to look at Shanghai again. There's serious concerns that, could Shanghai be underwater? In fact, it's not just Shanghai. 43% of the population in China are living in areas that by the end of the century will be somewhat underwater. And so it's one of the reasons why, the Chinese government takes climate change very seriously, because they are facing a massive threat. But Shanghai, I've been, in my preparation for my vulnerable delta project, been doing a lot more reading, and I was, I guess, not surprised, but that Shanghai is probably the most sensitive delta city to sea level rise. And besides the sea level rising, as water flows decrease from above, that means it just makes it even easier for both just regular sea level rise, or when typhoons and storms come, to really severely impact the city. Shanghai, small little city of 25 million, like a lot of Chinese cities, a lot of cement, right? They've just paved over everything, and they've been facing serious challenges from stormwater runoff. And I know that, I don't know where you live, but sometimes stormwater runoff, that sounds like kind of a joke. Well, it's no joke. It's a serious global problem. In Beijing, about 12 years ago, like half a dozen people drowned on the city streets. We had a city here in Maryland, Ellicott City, kind of an old, it's a small city, but all of half the downtown was kind of washed away from stormwater runoff, because Maryland, we're not, does our state even have 25 million? But we've also, been paving over things, and with increase in rainfall, it makes it, a little bit more dangerous. So another challenge why flow in the Yangtze River and getting to the delta is decreasing. The Yangtze River, besides being called upon to be the hydropower battery of the country, it's also there to quench the thirst of the north. Nanshui Beidiao, the Southwater Northward project. It was Mao Zedong had this idea. Evidently, it was after he swam in the Yangtze one time, where he looked at the river and he is supposedly quoted as saying, the South has a lot of water. Maybe we should move some of it north. And never throw down that kind of challenge to Chinese engineers. They've built it. The Eastern Line was actually built on top of the old Grand Canal, but then the Central Line was built. This is built starting in 2001, and the Central Line has also been built. Needs some pumping of the water, but it's been really vital for Beijing. As I said down below, my friend Ma Jun, who you'll see a picture of him in a little bit, gave a talk for me recently, and he shared the stat that 7 out of 10 cups of water in Beijing are from the Yangtze River. So it's draining water out of the river, but also want to note that because the water is pretty polluted, not only from ag runoff and industrial, but also sewage sometimes, that just on the eastern line, they've had to put in 400 wastewater treatment plants as they're moving the water up to clean it. It's being pumped. So this is actually a very energy intensive endeavor to move water like this. I mean, they're basically replumbing China, and as Ma Jun, who's a leading water activist in China, has said many times, that this is just a Band-Aid. I mean, North China only gets about 20% of China's water. I mean, and Beijing can't depend on just the supply side solution. And he said that about 12 years ago. And now today, as we're seeing the Yangtze River flow dropping so much, it's a crisis. I mean, a lot of people talk about air pollution being China's biggest problem, but I really see the biggest problem in China as water. All right, next slide. So before I start moving into solutions, just giving you one big view of the full basin. Maybe I should have done that first, but see the upstream with the dams, midstream facing their challenges with the pollution and lack of, I mean, there aren't as many floods today, but missing the wetlands. I mean, wetlands play a crucial role not only for flood, but to retain water. And China has been, notably in Wuhan. Wuhan is known for it's a wetland city, that they've been actually constructing a lot of wetlands or expanding, building onto existing wetlands and using them also as kind of like a natural wastewater treatment. And so it's, a filtration system. And it also helps be a source for when you get these big storms, so the stormwater runoff can go somewhere. So yeah, so just give you the image so you kind of picture the whole river, knowing that the whole river determines the health of the delta. And so, all right, let's talk policy, water policy. I like to think of, like, look at this picture, how's this of water policy? Well, I always like to think about water policy in China like the guys, the guys out in Beijing or in other Chinese cities who are playing Chinese chess. There are 2 guys playing, but notice all the men surrounding, that they'll reach down and kind of move the pieces around as well. That has been a challenge over the decades of water management in China. Used to have the water ministry, the ag ministry, Ministry of Water Resources, everyone trying to decide how water was going to be managed, who is responsible for it. And it was really big battles, which in the end often left to no true solutions. What's encouraging is that, well, and you end up with situations, I mean, in terms of like water quality. For many years, like about the stats that started about 10 years ago, were saying that something like 30 to 50% of all of China's surface water was so polluted it shouldn't come in contact with humans. So this is just isn't the Yangtze River, but all throughout China. And it was this water quality challenge that meant that when China declared a war on pollution, started with air pollution in 2014, and around 2015, they also started focusing on water. And it wasn't just a slogan. So 2015, they redid the water pollution control law, having stricter standards, stronger penalties against local governments. And even one of my favorite policies that they instigated at this time was called the river chief policy, where in every government jurisdiction around China, wherever there is a small, if it's a lake, a tributary, whatever, every river and creek has a government official who's been named the river chief. And I don't know how they'll actually ever implement this, but they said, you have a lifetime responsibility to make sure that the water quality stays good. And so we've seen this in the air sector, but now in the water sector, that local officials that their jobs and their promotions, development funding to their cities is going to depend on whether or not they can keep the water clean. And what's helping that enforcement is the fact that in 2018, the then Ministry of Environmental Protection got a new name and got a makeover, and they're now the Ministry of Ecological Environment, and they've been given more power to regulate. They've also been given responsibility over climate change. So, and this is an encouraging sign. When Ma Jun, my water guy, came and spoke for me a couple of weeks ago, he said that, over the past decade, we've seen a marked increase in quality of surface water. The sad news is that groundwater in cities is still pretty polluted, and that's kind of remains a tough nut. But I'm just kind of giving you an overall picture that on the governance side, that the government has become much more serious about water quality. I've already talked enough about the hydro battery. Questions in the Q&A on that. So now I want to also talk about the Yangtze River Protection Law. And this was pretty monumental. It came out in 2021, and it has laid out very strict targets, red lines that they call, in terms of the particularly water quality, development, banning certain types of development. And perhaps one of the most surprising initially was that they actually instituted a 10-year fishing ban. So that meant something like, 200,000 fishers at least, there must have been more, but that's the number I saw quoted, out of a job as of January 2021. There are also some limitations on aquaculture. Still a little bit unclear to me, like how strictly they will be enforcing that. But it is really encouraging that, the Yangtze River for many decades didn't have a strong river basin commission. The Yellow River Basin Commission is very strong, 40,000 people strong, centrally controlled. And so now the Chinese government is really trying to centralize their control to protect the Yangtze River, because they realize that if the Yangtze River falls into an even deeper crisis, that it will have huge impact on the economy and the health and livelihood of, I think it's like 400 million people who live in the basin. I think it's probably even more. Another encouraging sign, and you'll notice that the dates on this, 2021, 2018, they also passed a wetland protection law in 2021. So I know it just started, but it's also mandating, better protection of them, expansion of the wetlands, and encouragingly, there's also, they've been trying since like 2001 to try to get bans on land reclamation along the coast. And in 2018, it finally happened. China, over the past 30 years, has lost about 70% of their natural mangroves. And the mangroves, and also I mentioned like 50% of their coastal wetlands. When you lose these wetlands and these mangroves, the coastal cities and communities are much more vulnerable to sea level rise, to storms that come in. It's kind of like a sponge. And in fact, wetlands are increasingly becoming part of what's China's policy of sponge cities, where I mentioned to you, Wuhan, Shanghai also has on Chongming Island, and there are other areas. Again, remember, a delta is a wetland. They've been building on it for decades, hundreds of years, but they're starting to expand existing wetlands. And because this is insurance to help protect the city. Besides the wetlands, Shanghai is also, we're going back to the Delta again. Shanghai has also been erecting many sea walls. There's like 300 miles of levees up the Huangpu as well. More like when sea level rise and the storms come in and move on up the Huangpu and the Yangtze, that it will protect communities further up in the Delta from being flooded. And it's the Chinese government, and actually this year, I didn't put a slide for it, but this year they actually also passed a climate adaptation law, because the realization that as they're trying to decarbonize, mitigation isn't enough, and they really are starting to come up with more concrete plans on how cities can prepare for the inevitable deluge from the ocean. Oh, and last thing to also note that, besides wetlands, Shanghai, like other cities, Shenzhen is the king on this, is rooftop gardens, rain gardens throughout the city, porous sidewalks. I mean, they're really pulling out all the stops. And these are also kind of both, climate adaptation and a little bit of mitigation. Heat, Shanghai is evidently heat because of the heat island effect has had increases in temperature the fastest of any Chinese city. Shanghai's top on everything. But one of the reasons that the wetlands are also vitally important is that this is giving you the example of the migratory flyway, some of the paths, and as you can see, I mean, you can't quite see from the arrows, but a lot of these birds that are flying through will also stop over in the Shenzhen Pearl River deltas, also obviously in the Yangtze Delta. It's critical for these bird species. And that was another one of the, besides, climate resiliency and protecting water resources. This year, China, well, it's for the past 3 years, China's been the head of the Convention on Biodiversity. And the final meeting will be actually held in Montreal, because it can't be held in Kunming. And I think that's another reason why we've seen much more policy action in China on wetland and river protection, which again bodes well for the health of the rivers and the health of the deltas. Now let's talk just a few minutes about just giving you a little smattering of some examples of, there is some lively grassroots activism in China that is working to improve water issues. Ma Jun, he created the NGO Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, IPE, back about 12 years ago. His very first project was to make I should get a newer picture. This is an older map of his, but he created China's first online water pollution map, where people could go in and search and find out who's violating pollution laws. And he used government data, and it ended up being a good favor for the government because it collated the data so it can help the government in terms of their own enforcement. I mean, I remember when he first started doing this, I wondered, ooh, are you going to get in trouble, Majin? But he didn't get in trouble. He also, his website also does air pollution, soil pollution, even has a decarbonization and a plastic waste map. And so he's really been trying, but in the water sector, he's really done so much to kind of burst open the information transparency about how bad water quality is, which kind of has lit a fire underneath the government as well. Another one of his maps that I should have put up, but I didn't right now, was part of when I mentioned, remember the Ministry of Ecological Environment, when they started getting more power, they teamed up with the Minister of Housing and Urban and Rural Affairs in China, and they issued, I think they thought they were being cool. They had this public announcement and said, Chinese people, if you see a black and stinky river, basically send us a WeChat photo and geolocate it. I don't know what they were thinking, because they got, I'm going to use a water pun. They were flooded with images from around the country, also including the, Yangtze River, about all the pollution problems. And these government agencies said, we don't know what to do. So they went to Ma Jun, and he created a map. And now, I mean, this is basically a citizen science generated pollution map. And so Ma Jun and then also some other NGOs have created more local maps from the data. And it's really helped the government, the Ministry of Environmental Protection, to go out and figure out where do they need to focus on cleanup. And notably, Ma Jun's maps also note government action or inaction on these. So just wanted to kind of just give you a quick highlight of one important area where there's been some really amazing water activism. There's also some grassroots watchdogs. I started with Hunan. I have to end my slide deck talking about Hunan. On the left, you'll see a photo of a volunteer from the NGO Green Hunan. They started up also about 10 years ago. And they had this, started off kind of, well, small with like 500-600 river watchers. And they would walk along the rivers almost every day, and they would take photos if they saw some pollution, they report it to the NGO Green Hunan, or sometimes going straight to the Changsha government about if they saw some kind of strange colored pollution or bad smell. And it really helped the local Changsha Environmental Protection Bureau to find out where was there a problem. And so they were kind of seen as partners. And this photo here, this gentleman, he went a step further and started, he was a shop owner that lived right near the river, and which is a major tributary to the Yangtze River. And he started taking samples of this of an area where the water was coming out in strange colors. And over several months, he was able to present this data to the local Environment Bureau. And within a year, the water was flowing clear. And it just kind of, I think that a lot of times we think about, China, environmental authoritarianism, so much top down, right? The policies that they're doing and quick action. But in reality, grassroots activists have also been playing an important role, and they've been given, I think, a fair amount of space in the area of water, which I find pretty notable. On the right side, we have the Shanghai Rendu. It's an NGO that focuses on plastic waste. I didn't talk a lot about plastic waste today, but I can answer more questions on it. I mean, China's huge problems with plastic waste. It's the largest plastic, it's like a plastic waste superpower. But this group, they not only do they go around and collect plastic waste and on the coastline around Shanghai, they've built up networks along all of China's coast. Other NGOs are copying their model, not just picking up waste, but auditing the waste and finding out what are the sources, what are the companies responsible. Oh, I should mention too, I forgot, with the Green Hunan, they actually ended up getting a grant from Alibaba to take their River Watcher program and start doing trainings. And they've been taking this kind of activism and training people all the way up the Yangtze River. So just kind of a quick side note to show you about their impact. Yeah, so just, giving you kind of a little taste of what some of the activists are doing. And also want to make note that something that in the course of me, diving deeper, pun intended, into Delta work, I've noticed that in the Yangtze and also the Pearl River Delta, that, I mean, Guangdong and Shanghai, it makes sense. They're, they're rich areas, and they've been in both areas, in both deltas. There's been this is actually near Shanghai, that they've been building out more offshore wind power. Because if one of the biggest threats to your delta is climate change, added a little bit of impetus for these cities in particular to start investing more into clean energy technology. Notably down in Guangdong, in a city in the Delta, they're in the process of setting up the world's largest offshore wind turbine. It's going to be 43 gigawatts. Just to give you a sense, around the world today, there is only 56 gigawatts being generated by offshore wind power. And this one farm that is in process in Guangdong will almost equal that. I mean, China is already half of the offshore wind. And to give you a sense of scale, 43 gigawatts is the amount of electricity that you would need to power the entire country of Norway. So I want to give you just enough information to make you dangerous in the Q&A. This is my closeout slide. This is the city of Chongqing, also a major city that for many years was dumping a lot of sewage and garbage into the Yangtze River, but they've been starting to clean up their act, in great part being forced by the central government. And there's some of my contact info there. And so Panwen, right at almost 30 minutes, because I started a little bit after the top of the hour. So I will stop there. I will stop share. And I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the informative presentation. So we have just a few questions for you. And the first question is, mangroves, surface water are more amenable to action, but groundwater pollution will last a long time. Can anything really be done?
That is the question of the century. I think that, yeah, I mean, groundwater pollution is almost intractable. But I think that one of the issues of concern in China is that in many cities, 90% of their water is sourced from groundwater. And that means that it's potentially dangerous water for the public. So what it's one, a kind of a, roundabout solution is, well, one important solution is that instead of just like Beijing, I mean, that's why they're not pumping as much of their groundwater for their drinking. They're taking the South North Water Transfer Project. But one policy that needs a little extra push in China, it may make your stomach turn a bit, but water recycling. Fanwen, do you know what water recycling is?
Like purification of water. I don't have much knowledge about
that's okay. It's basically following the Singapore. You guys know about Singapore? They have something called new water. Okay, the gross way to describe it is toilet to tap. So basically taking sewage water. I mean, usually when wastewater treatment plants treat water, and then they'll either, stick it down into the groundwater or they'll put it out into a river. But water recycling is a policy that Singapore, they're surviving on it because they didn't want to depend on necessarily, they didn't know if they could always depend on Malaysia to give them their water. And they didn't want to be vulnerable, right? Water security is vital for every country, but water recycling this way, so where you treat wastewater to the point where it's potable, or you can also, treat it partially. And that, I mean, something that is very foreign in the US, but in European countries, they also have what they call gray water taps, so that sometimes that you can treat water to a certain level, and then you can use that water for non-drinking purposes. So sometimes even for like industry, for landscaping. In Southern California, of course, the country of California, they do everything cool. I've brought a lot of Chinese delegations on tours of wastewater treatment plants, because in the US, we're doing cool things in wastewater treatment plants. One of them is that you have some wastewater treatment plants that start treating water. So it's not to the level where you can drink it, but it's to a level where it could be used for industry, or maybe cleaned up extra to use for certain industries. So it's kind of like a boutique wastewater treatment plant. And then also in California, this one treatment plant in LA that I visited, they also will treat water to a a gray, relatively high level, and then they inject it into the aquifer to help shield California's groundwater from saltwater intrusion. And so there's these very clever ways that you can start, increasing your water supply, not just by water transfer projects. And so I think that China needs to do more on that front. I mean, there's a lot also that can be done, and I think this is going to be true. And I'm thinking of Jefferson Fox on the call, because he's our ag guy in Southeast Asia, that finding ways to make agriculture more efficient in their water use. I mean, around the world, ag, they drink the biggest cup. I'm not saying, that they shouldn't have it, but more water efficiency. And some of that, maybe that comes about a little bit of pain, but that also would do a lot to help, protect urbanites in China from having to drink their groundwater.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That was very informative.
And if I'm getting too long, Fanwen, you just go like,
we have plenty of time. We have like 20 minutes. So.
I love water issues, so just keep asking.
Yes, because the next set of questions will be focusing on China's water policy. Next question is, any idea on how long it will take for the recent policy changes that you described to begin to take effect?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I have two answers to that. One is, China, environmental authoritarianism, right? Some things like the fishing ban, boom, that was easy. But whether or not it was just, I mean, keep in mind, did someone go and warn these fishers that they were about to lose a job? We hope so. But there's, this kind of aggressive top-down enforcement to protect nature can have some not so good outcomes. Let's give the example of in Dali. It's in western Yunnan. There's a lake there called Lake Arhu. Have you been there, Fanwen? Have you been down that part of it?
No.
You need to go there. It's a beautiful lake, and it used to be very remote. I went there when I lived in Yunnan my second year in China, and you have to take long bus rides to get there, and it was just pristine mountains surrounding it. Well, it's become a hot tourist spot. There's 4-star hotels there now. There's freeways that get you there. And so, of course, there's a lot of development. And the lake quality started going down. So there became an order from on high that said, we need to protect these important lakes. We need to get rid of any kind of activity that's within like 150 meters of the lake. And so you know what happened?
What
The
happened?
bulldozers came in, Fanwen. So people, their houses, some houses were just ripped in half because they said, local government said, they said 150 meters. So all around, it was true. They got rid of the construction that was close to the lake, which was officially illegal, but wasn't exactly done in consultation with the local communities. So there can be some not so good outcomes. But again, sometimes, you know, there are, I mean, I think the ban on land reclamation on the coasts, that is easier for them to enforce, and that I think the Ministry of Ecological Environment and some other agencies have also been working to police this. I mean, there's been plenty of cases where I think it's so weird, land speculation, where they'll make land, you know, in hope that maybe eventually someone will build on it, and then it gets abandoned. So I think there's going to be efforts to make sure that some of these, you know, maybe get returned to the ocean or turned into wetlands. There's a lot going on. And one thing I'm excited about in our project, Fanwen, is that I've been reaching out to a lot of people in China, and I'm going to start talking soon to some really powerhouse NGOs that are working on mangrove restoration. And there's even one group that is working in China and Southeast Asia. So there's going to be kind of a linkage between you and your other colleagues at the East-West Center are Southeast Asianists. So it's kind of cool that there's already some Chinese and Southeast Asian cooperation on protecting mangroves, which again aren't just in deltas, but there's definitely a lot in deltas.
That's awesome. Okay, thank you. Next question, related to the previous one, focusing on the lack of effectiveness of Chinese natural resource policy guidelines governing their environmental practices. So the question is, how well these new domestic environmental laws and regulations are implemented inside China? And are you ready for the follow-up question to that question? Is relatedly, what that says about rich countries cleaning up their act at home while oftentimes exporting the dirty environmental practicing to least poorer nations.
Yeah, that person is hinting quite strongly at China's Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the domestic. I think I touched on some of this before, but that I think that the wetland protection law, I mean, it just started last year, but there are, you know, I gave you just a smattering. There are some grassroots groups that are there to monitor. One of my favorite groups, if you people listening today want to know, you should definitely look at, there's a website called Birding Beijing that focuses, I mean, it's on birds, but they also look at a lot on wetlands, and the International Crane Foundation. So Birding Beijing is based in Beijing, but International Crane Foundation, they were one of the first US NGOs to go into China back in the 1990s. And they're working with local governments and farming and fishing communities to help, you know, really, you know, protect the wetlands, but also manage them in ways that still doesn't mean that you're going to unemploy the farmers. And that's another kind of example, like the unintended outcomes of some policies. I mean, they're just nature protection. Like there's a policy, you know, where as China was setting up they're setting up national parks, and they're starting to do kind of what we did in the US. So like indigenous people who live in these areas are getting moved out and kind of resettled. But there is one, you know, so that sometimes making sure that these nature protection policies are put in force, that they also, you know, protecting the birds and the wetlands, but you also have to protect the farmers. And I think what's really exciting is, again, International Crane Foundation, you know, over the years, you know, the nature conservancies there, Conservation International, WWF. There's a lot of these international groups that they've been in China for decades now, and have built these kind of partnerships. And so I think that the wetland protection law has a good chance of being implemented, in a great part because, you know, the awareness, one term I didn't use yet today, that the Chinese government is quite keen on, and well, it's kind of a slogan internationally, nature-based solutions. So using wetlands are a way that you can use nature-based solutions. It's usually referring to climate change. When you protect wetlands or soils or forests, that those areas can become sinks for carbon. But they also have the benefit that there's the flood control potential, the cooling, livelihood. I know it's not China, but I have to give it this example. In Calcutta, the city took a natural wetland and massively, you know, kind of expanded it, fixed it up, and it is now the wastewater treatment for Calcutta. That it's used to filter the water, and while it's not potable, but because all this sewage water has been going through it's this massive wetland, and it's become a place for people, for fruit trees, for fishers, employing something like 50,000 people. Crazy. But so you have to think that you know, that there are ways of thinking that these kind of nature-based solutions that have multiple benefits. I mean, that's both, just to give you fun fact, because I love water facts. Did you know, Fanwen, that in cities that wastewater treatment can use 30% of your energy?
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, well, if you have wastewater treatment, but so using 30% of your energy, and think about in China, a country dependent on coal-fired power, that's a lot of CO2 emissions. So that cleaning water becomes a source of climate change. But when you use, you know, there's the idea, you know, not every place can use wetlands as their wastewater treatments, but there's also another strategy to use to capture the methane. You cook up the sludge, the poop, and it emits methane. You capture that methane and you use it to power your wastewater treatment plants. About half the US wastewater treatment plants use this, and increasingly in China, they're also using this strategy. Sorry, just kind of like going on a tangent, but get me back online here. We have other questions. I love these questions. Keep them coming.
We have quite a bunch of questions.
Okay, I will be more succinct. And remember, if I get too long, just make this gesture.
We have about 12 minutes left. So next
we can do it.
Has Xi Jinping taken any position on water issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, it's part of his war on pollution. Keep in mind, I don't know if you guys remember, but 2012, when he came into office, that was the year when we had the huge air apocalypse in Beijing, where air quality index was over 1,000. And, you know, I mean, asthma attacks. I mean, and the stat came out that like 1.7 million people die early every year from air pollution. So, so Xi Jinping, you know, he really has made the environment and also climate issues his political issue, because it's a question of survival. I mean, the air pollution, the water pollution in China, and we could go into soil and all this stuff, but these basically, it undermines the economy, it angers the public. I mean, in the late 6 through 2013, you really saw a lot of urbanites protesting, so on social media and on the streets, about air quality and water issues. So the Communist Party knows, you know, and Xi Jinping, that if they want to keep the public happy, they've got to deal with this issue. But also, I mean, on the energy side, clean energy is a big market for China. They've produced most of the solar PV panels in the world. And he kind of sees this, you know, and you see it in the priorities in the 5-year plans and the investment. I mean, China's #1 in investing in clean energy, but they also invest in a lot of pollution control. And China wants to, you know, he said, I mean, China's head of the Convention on Biodiversity, he said that, you know, China wants to become a leader also in conservation, you know, conservation and biodiversity protection around the globe, which is still going to be a challenge. I forgot in that last question that, you know, China's Belt and Road Initiative doesn't have a good record in terms of protecting the environment, in terms of the construction, because they always say that the Chinese companies go in and they will obey local regulations. So when Chinese companies go on the road, they're not necessarily bringing the stricter kind of laws that they have back home with them. I'll keep it there.
Okay, thank you. Next question focuses on water worries. And the question is, what extent are China's water policies addressing regional, not just the national scale, water worries? Is it serving as a responsible steward of the watersheds feeding the river system in South and Southeast Asia?
We can get this done quickly. No. That's the short answer. I mean, yeah, I mean, China, they're building dams on the Mekong, right? And they're in the upstream. They're not in the they're observer in the Mekong River Commission. I think most of you probably know this. And I think that, and then, in India, they're very concerned about increasing water diversions, even further upstream on the Yangtze River, even up in Tibet. But I have to say that 60% of the water that flows into the Ganges comes from the Indian side, but still, they rightfully need to be concerned. Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's an area where China could do a better job. And I mean, I think with some of its stand neighbors that Kazakhstan, I don't know if it's Kazakhstan, I'm going to be learning more about this soon too. I'm going there. But there have been kind of water disputes also with some of the stands on the border. So it's could use improvement, even though China was the head of the Ramsar wetlands of global significance. There was just a meeting in China on this in Wuhan. And so, wait and see. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see in the next few years if China does, want to become a leader in terms of biodiversity protection. If you're interested, there's this guy named Jeffrey Chi that wrote a great article about China taking their nature-based solutions overseas. I can send you that information later. Okay.
Okay, we have 8 minutes left, and we have last set of questions, so you can take your time and explain.
Give me two at a time.
Okay, there's just 2 left. So can you speak more to the to scale and centralization versus decentralization here? For example, Beijing versus provincial versus prefecture versus citizen science, in terms of what you see working or not working for effective environmental legislation and implementation. And also, is it an important issue to consider?
Kind of relates to my dissertation. I love this person.
Person.
Yeah. So Xi Jinping, do I know this person? I'll tell me later who it was. Oops, sorry, I just knocked something off. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I already said that, when you look at the policies, there's been a big re-centralization and really kind of going after the provinces with hammers, I mean, this is across all environmental issues. And I gave you the example of Arhu, and, I think that, mistakes are made when we're seeing that like the space for public participation and having transparency, it's been decreasing in this space, which is really a disappointment, because the environment for my 23 years at the Wilson Center, I mean, the one reason I've loved my job is I've really seen that this has been like the most progressive policy area in China, because they've seen they needed to correct it. And there used to be environmental NGOs used to have more elbow room, both international and domestic. And some of that is getting constrained again. I mean, it's just, and the fact that people don't always have, a voice. That said, I mean, there is bottom up, local governments can try to lobby and compete for resources, to benefit from some of these policies. And not going to say that things are corruption free in China, but I think that there is a kind of loss of not having more voice from the people in some of these policies. That said, local governments, there are a lot of examples throughout China where, like, local NGOs, that they create these kind of partnerships. That's why I gave you the example of Green Hunan, that in Hunan, the provincial and the Changsha city EPBs, Environmental Protection Bureau, sorry, they just did not have the bandwidth to deal with all of these problems. And I remember I was really tickled. I had one of their staff members, he stayed with me for a month at the Wilson Center a few years ago. And he said that they were really surprised. They've been doing this work with the government, and then the provincial government said to them, hey, in our next 5-year plan, could you guys write our water section? So you have this Chinese NGO working with universities to kind of help craft, better water stewardship. And so I think that there are some bright lights where at the local level, where there is this awareness of the talent that they have at the local level. And, and there's some great NGOs like the Global Environmental Institute that they've been working to build up, kind of building networks around, like, for example, conservation. So not just with green groups, but with women's, indigenous peoples groups, not just in China, but in Southeast Asia and in Africa. So there is dynamism in China's NGO sector. And what I find fascinating is that some of this is actually going overseas. I'll be quiet. We got one more question and like 4 minutes left. Go.
Yeah, there's one question. Since you alluded to during your presentation that plastic is a major issue, and we have 4 minutes left, can you use that time to elaborate more on the plastic waste in China?
Ooh, thank you. I don't know. Was that Jefferson Fox who gave you that question? Maybe. Don't tell. You tell me later. Yeah. So I've actually been working on a project called Turning the Tide on Plastic Waste in Asia for the past 2 years. And, looking at not just China and Southeast Asia, but also the United States. And really, when you look at the numbers, the US and China, we are the plastic waste superpowers. I mean, we're the larger producers and consumers. And China's big challenge, China, they did something that changed the world, right? Do you remember in 2018? Do you remember what happened, Fanwen? The green sword policy, where the Chinese government said, we've been taking everyone's plastic waste to recycle here. We're stopping. Boom. They closed their doors. And then suddenly in the US and European and Australian and Japanese cities are like, whoa, what do I do with my recycling? Because China, they had been taking like US and all the international recyclables, particularly plastic, to help for industrial feedstock to make things with. And it was something that really helped power their economy. And it used to be really kind of small scale, private, informal plastic collectors and recyclers. And, as China has developed and, the country's booming, the growing middle class. And what do middle class people do? We consume more stuff and single-use plastics. And China realized that they were drowning in waste. Their landfills were getting full, pollution, plastic. There used to be, snow in the Yangtze River, those styrofoam plastic boxes. Happily, about 10 years ago, they banned them on like the ships that went down the river at least. But yeah, China has, a booming, food delivery system. I think that one company, Meituan, that does food delivery, that every day, one day of their one company doing deliveries produces enough plastic bags to carpet like 164 football stadiums.
Wow.
Just one. So Xi Jinping, one of the impetus for closing the doors to global recyclables was that we got to focus on our country. And so in the last few years, China's been really, they now have a war on waste where they're trying to, they forced, they encouraged 46 cities, including Shanghai, which was the most strict one, to come up with waste sorting, waste collection and sorting policies. And in Shanghai, it's this real kind of big brother system that they developed, which I think is going to be the national model, where in your apartments, you have to come down, and some of them even have facial recognition so that if you don't sort your waste well, really kind of draconian measures to make sure that people sort their waste. And, and because they want to try to collect enough waste so then they could kind of create their own supply chain to recycle more. But there is a movement, kind of like just like in the US. In fact, the two countries are very parallel on this, starting to look at, well, maybe we should reduce plastic production. But that's a challenge because Chinese and US, well, definitely China, but US oil companies are like #1 in the world in terms of producing plastic. Because as the world has been pushing to control climate change, there's a big pressure on the oil and gas industry, reducing use. Electric vehicles, it'll go down even more. So the petrochemical industry in China, US, and around the world is shifting to plastics. So, but there is talk in China having more regulations to kind of crack down on, plastic production. There's a national ban on some single-use plastics, and I think they're going to continue moving forward. Did I give you enough plastic for the day? Was that your sufficient plastic allotment?
Yes, thank you. There's actually 2 more questions.
Yeah, do it quick.
Do you see AI technology being applied to climate control?
Oh, for climate change?
Climate, yeah.
I'd have to I don't know off the top of my head. I think, no, sorry, I have to skip that one.
It's
But
okay.
I'm going to go look it up later. Sorry.
Next question is, last question also, is who's better? Is China or US better environmental actor? Which one is better?
Well, I mean, I think that, in terms of quality, our air and our waterways are cleaner. But if you think of climate change, the US is still number 1. Historically, we emitted a lot more. We consume the most per capita of energy, plastic. Yeah, we're number 1 in plastic consumption, by the way, just to let you know that. And so, we produce, our environmental footprint is way outsizes, per capita than China. But China, but both in terms of climate change, we will not be able to solve the problem if the US and China don't come together on this issue, which they did 2 days ago. So you can see I have an extra smile on my face that we're talking together to China about climate change. Yeah, it's hard. I don't want to say it's apples and oranges. China is, it's the 2nd largest economy, probably soon to be the 1st largest economy. I think in terms of climate change, they have done a lot over the past 10 years to reduce their emissions, but I think that they lost a little bit of their speed in decarbonization, I think. And under the previous administration, where the US broke off ties with China for cooperative issues, now that the Biden administration is stepping back in, I think that there's been a really healthy kind of cooperative competitors dynamic between the 2 countries on climate change, and also on illegal wildlife trade. We can talk about that later. So because in China's 14th 5-year plan was a big disappointment to a lot of people who were, kind of China watchers looking on climate. That, Xi Jinping, they've got the right targets. They're the number 1 investor on renewable energy, but they still need to go even faster to even meet the own goals that they set. I'll leave it at that right now. You have to invite me back to do a climate talk. But yeah, I think again, yeah, but again, as you can see, a lot of what I've seen in my work over the years, that when the US, China come together on these issues, good change happens.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, for sharing your work with the audience today. And thank you also to our audience. It's now 3:03, so we have to end here. Yeah. And I invite everyone to attend our next EWC Insights on December 14th at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. And until then, have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Bye.
Great questions, by the way. Bye-bye. Thank you.